Hey, Aaron Rabinowitz here for Red Giant TV. In our recent film Tempo, directed by Seth Worley, one of the coolest effects was a swarm of bees being slowed down with the tempo device and then exploding. Later, we see the bees attack in high speed. So in this episode of Red Giant TV, Harry Frank will walk you through the process of creating the bees using a combination of Cinema 4D and Trapcode Particular, as well as tracking the camera motion, compositing the bees, and ramping the time for the tempo slowdown effect. Alright, take it away, Harry.
Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this tutorial I'd like to talk about one of the effects shots that I worked on in the short film Tempo. Now if you've not had a chance to check this out, I highly recommend that you do. Simply go to redgiant.com/tempo and you can view it right there on the page. The shot in particular that we'll be talking about is one of the experimental shots where a box of live bees is subjected to the tempo device, which can either speed up or slow down time for whatever is in the path of the gun. So in this case, we are actually going to shoot a swarm of bees that have just been released from a box, and then they will freeze, actually not freeze, but jump to a very slow motion. And then after that, well, they promptly explode. What we'll be focusing on in this tutorial is the particle motion of the bees. We've got two layers of particles that we are using here. I'm using form right here for the first shot where the bees are inside the box, so they're not emitting and shooting everywhere. And then these remaining shots all share the same layer of particular, which made it easier for the production process for me because I only had to worry about one layer and not change the settings between one layer and another. It also made the bees to be in a consistent spot from one shot to the next. So on this cut, they're in the same positions as they are in this cut right here, and even when we cut back and go to the explosion. Now, at this beginning shot here, you do see a couple stray bees actually fly away, but those are just manually done, animated in After Effects. So let's talk about the approach to this. I already said that we're going to be sharing one layer, but we have to have multiple bees in here, so we have to have different angles that we can use, so the bees are not all facing the exact same angle. We also need the bees to be animated because we have their wings flapping, so we'll need some sort of stock footage or 3D model of bees. And then we'll have to find a way to control this time because they go from fast here, where their wings are actually flapping quite quickly, and then control the time of the wing flapping as they slow down. Now this actually uses a very clever technique using the subframe sampling part of Trapcode Particular's custom particles, so that we can sort of overcrank the flapping of the wings, squeeze it together using the time stretching of After Effects. But being that the subframe sampling is enabled, those frames, those missing frames, are actually still viewable by Particular. So we can actually control the wing flapping down to a very, very slow speed using this technique. And I'll go into much more detail on that, but that's basically the overview. So the starting point for me was to simply get some sort of bee to work with. And I went to Turbo Squid and got myself a bee, and I rendered it out from a couple different angles. I animated the wings. I just put a couple wings on there and used some espresso to take time, map that to a formula using a sine function, and remap it on the other wing. Very similar to doing this in After Effects using time and a sine function and all that kind of stuff. But basically, I ended up with an animated bee that I rendered out a few different ways. And in After Effects, these look like these right here. Zoom in. Here's one. Here's the other. Basically a side view. And here's the other, in a reverse angle. So as you can see, the wings are flapping quite slowly. Now, you can see this is actually over 1.5 minutes in its length for the source material. But all I did in the interpretation, which I can't even squeeze on the screen here, actually right down here at the bottom. So I set it to loop 100 times. The source material is actually quite short. But the reason we do this is to render it very slowly, loop it many, many times, and then we'll speed it back up and then slow it down again in Trapcode Particular. So let's get the basics going on this. So let me jump to a new shot. Actually, let me put the reference edit into a new composition here. So with this, I'll be working at 1280 by 720. And let's jump to the first shot right here. And I'll add a layer that is the size of the comp that has Trapcode Form applied. And to do this, I usually just use my FT toolbar, which does just that. It has a little script built in. But you can manually create a solid that's the size of the comp and apply Trapcode Form. So right about here is where I want this to start. So I'm simply going to trim it up right there. Let's zoom in just a little bit and look at our basic form functions. So I want to take this size down quite a bit, scale it out quite a bit. Actually, before I get too far, I should probably have a camera in here. Let's put this down in position down here, rotate it just a little bit. And that's a start. So right now, these are all individual particles. I have 70 particles going up and down in Y, which is quite a bit. I'll knock this down maybe to 15 or so for the time being. I might even use less than that. Let's go into the particle section and turn up that size so we can see these potential B's quite a bit better. I'll set the color to a dark color, like just a dark brown or whatever right now. The transfer mode is set to add by default, and we don't want that, so I'll set this to normal. Looks like my particle size is still quite big. Let's knock that down by half and thin out the number of particles even more. So maybe 30 along the X, 15 up and down in Y. Don't forget we have 3 rows going back in Z space to get some depth in there. So to get the motion here, I'm going to go to the Fractal Field, which allows us to affect various parameters of the particles based on a 3D fractal field. So I can have it affect the size, opacity, but I'm going to have it affect the displacement of the B's. In fact, I can move this down just a little bit more using that center XY and squeeze together the size and Y. There we go. Looking pretty good. So I want to have this flow evolution animating so that these actually move quite a bit. But you notice the areas of displacement seem to be in fairly large chunks. I can see this sort of wavy kind of nature in here because it's using a fractal field that is, for our purposes, pretty large. So I'm going to change that scale by using the F scale. This is a fractal scale, which is actually kind of an inverted control value. So the higher that is, the smaller the fractal scale is. So if I bring that down, that's a lot better. Well, my flow evolution is quite high. Let's bring that way down to maybe 100 or so. All right, let's not deal with camera cuts just yet. So let me set a range to end right there. Just focus on this one shot right now. So that's a start. We'll probably want motion blur on all this stuff. But I think that's pretty good. Now, obviously, we need to account for the hand, the box, the glass plate, all that kind of stuff. That is all in the details. So some of that I'll try to show to you, and some of it I'll just pull from the existing finished comp. But what I don't want is for these to extend beyond the glass. So I'm going to scrub through this and find the point where they move the highest in the y-axis and just push it down a little bit. I'm going to take the size and Y down just a little bit more just to compress these all together a bit and move this up just a little bit more. I might want more particles along the X. There we go. It's a very organic kind of feeling. Maybe I want fewer particles, but I don't know. We'll adjust it as we go. Fairly okay, and then I go back to the original, and it's actually nothing like the original. So let's just reference our settings here. So I used 36 by 18 by 3. What have we got now? We've got 36 by 18 by 3. And here I've got 37 by 12 by 3. Fairly close. We'll push the particles of Y up just a little bit more. So let's use a custom particle for these, because I think we're just about done fiddling with all the controls within Form. And I'm going to go into my footage here. I'll pick one of these, this B loop 2, which looks like that. I'll just turn off the visibility because I don't need that. And in Form, I'll go to the particle type, set the particle type to a sprite, which is an image that always faces the camera. Set this texture to use the B loop number 2, and I will have it use a random loop. Now, because I imported this and set this to loop over and over, my source footage is actually, as I mentioned, 1.5 minutes long. So every single particle is being mapped to a 1.5 minutes long source footage, and that's actually quite an inefficient way to do this. So I'll select this and hit Shift Command C, leave all attributes in the reference comp, and this will be B loop 2. In fact, I'm going to call this B loop 2 fast. I'm going to speed this up because in the form layer we never have the slow motion to deal with. So these are always in fast motion. So we're going to make this a lot more efficient to render. Like I said, over 1.5 minutes. These are flapping bees. The duration it takes for bees to flap one time is probably not much greater than 1 second. In fact, 1 second is being extremely generous. So let's just find our loop points here. So the wings are up right there. They come back down and back up. Right there. Okay. So I'm going to hit Option Command T to enable time remapping and hit a keyframe right there. And that is going to be my loop point. So this will go down and back up. Now I can trim this up. I set the end of the range right there by hitting N. And now I can right click up here and trim the comp to that work area. So now I have a loop, and this will render a lot more efficiently in my Trapcode form layer. Now I'm not seeing anything right now. My form layer is actually moved forward in time, and to accurately sample that, I need to bring this particle layer forward in time. So I just hit the right bracket here so that the particle layer actually starts at the same time as the Trapcode form layer. Now, just to make this render a little quicker, I'm going to lower my particle counts just a little bit. So I'll set this to 2 particles in Z, maybe 24 in X and 12 in Y, just to speed things along just a little bit. Let's unsolo that. And I think we're doing fairly well. I'm going to lower the size down to maybe about 8. Now, if we don't like the idea of all of these particles facing the same way, so basically we've got one B that's facing the same way for each of them, I can go back in this B loop and maybe we'll just call this B loop fast. So instead of using one B, I'll double the duration of this comp. So now we'll make it 10 frames long. I'm going to take this one and duplicate it, move that forward in time, and then go back to my project here, and I'll grab one more of these. Maybe I'll grab this one that's facing the opposite direction. And for whatever reason, the color ended up just a tad different on this one than this one. Like I changed my lighting setup or something like that. So I'll do a little bit of color correction on here. I'll just use Colorista. fact, I can just use Colorista Free, which is, of course, a free download. So I can go in here, push the shadows a little bit warmer to match this other one. This one has just a little bit of a bluish touch to it. So I'm going to push the midtones a little more into a warm direction here. That matches a little bit better. So I've got my B loop, I've got 1 and 2. These things split right in the middle. So I've got a duration of 10 frames. I've got 5 frames for one and 5 frames for the other. So back in my edit here, in fact, this is still called reference. Let's call this the B swarm. Let's go to Trapcode Form and set this to split clip loop. So what it's going to do is take that composition, split it the number of times we tell it right here. So number of clips is 2. So it splits those evenly and randomly assigns one or the other clip to the particles. And if we don't like that random distribution, we can simply select a different random seed and it will completely randomize how the particle is assigned for each or the texture is assigned for each particle. So next we need to mat out stuff that is going to be, should be obscuring the bees. Now we're going to have a number of different things that need to mat this out. So I am going to start with one solid layer with a mask on it, but it's going to need to go through several cuts here. So eventually what I'm going to do is pre-compose these mats into another composition. But for right now, I'll just make the solid. So let's make our solid layer called the mat. Actually, this is just for the form mat. So I'll call this my form mat. And let me bring the opacity down quite a bit. And I'll get my pen tool here, and let's just draw out this basic shape of the box. Oops, I'm using Roto Bezier because I was doing a little bit of roto with this earlier. So let's go like this, 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 and this. I'm just going to do the shape of the box right now. Let's put this above the form layer. F4 to show our track mats and modes, and I'm going to set this to use the alpha inverted mat. And turn up this opacity. So now we've got the hand to contend with. Now, you can do it whichever way you want. You can do it in After Effects if you'd like. We can also do it in Mocha if we want. Let's take a look at the shot and figure out what the best tool is to use. So it's basically staying mostly in the same position but moving around a little. But that movement is going to be quite critical. So I would recommend using Mocha. So let's take this reference and actually, rather than using the compressed version, let's get our edit aligned. So I'm going to go into my footage here under my plates. This is the first shot that has effects on it. So this is Lab Bees number 1. And I'm just going to solo this reference edit, go to the cut point right there, and align this plate with that first frame. And these should be exactly the same. So this one that's less compressed and has a much clearer image is the one that I will use in Mocha AE. This should be a pretty easy roto for us. Let me scale this down to fit the window here. Hold down Z so I can zoom in here, and X to pan around. So I'll just track the back of the hand right here. Hopefully I can get a fairly decent planar track off of the back side of the hand, which is fairly flat. So we're at the beginning here. Let's go to track and track this forward. Okay, pretty straightforward. So this will be my track layer. Track. So let's lock that, and then we'll create a new layer. This will be our rotoscope layer. So let's start down here and just start drawing in I'm going to draw just this front hand because the other hand is in the background, and bees can actually go in front of, behind this hand, but in front of that hand. And that's how I'm going to do it. All right, let's zoom in again because I don't think I got some of these quite dead on. I'll hit select all and sort of soften all these points just a little bit. All right, and then tap the asterisk on the keypad to get back to 100%. Actually, let's zoom out a little bit. So this is going to be the sort of the roto layer. So I'll call that roto and then go to link to track. I'll link that hand track or link the roto to the hand track. So as the plane moves, as tracked by the hand, it will map that to the roto that I did. And it looks actually pretty good. Maybe a little adjustment up here at the top. Right there. And I'm going to call that good. So let's select that roto layer. We're going to export the shape layer for Mocha Shape Data for After Effects. Copy that to the clipboard. Hop back to After Effects. And I mentioned I'm going to use multiple mats here. So now I'm going to pre-compose that mat layer. So this will be my form mat. I'm going to jump in here, create a new solid. This will be the hand roto. And actually jump right to the beginning of that range that I set because that is where I did that roto. I did the roto on that one clip. And it's actually very handy to keep a reference of that edit or even the background plate in your mat layer. And you can do this. You can. I'm going to take this layer, let's copy that, go into my my roto layer so I can reference this. But what I can do is simply right-click on it, set that to guide layer, and now this layer is not going to blend, or it's not going to composite itself with the rest of the images. Basically, it's going to, in terms of After Effects, when it goes to render, it's going to ignore this video. Okay, so that's our form mat. So we should be obscuring the hand. Looks like I didn't quite get the hand all the way. That's fine, actually. So we can do a little bit of round tripping here. We said, okay, that's no good. Let's go back in and fix that roto. So let's go back in here, select this layer. So I just needed to drag some of these points back to the sleeve and add maybe 1 point in here just to get the curve to match up. Match up the curvature of that hand in there. All right, that should be good. Let's try that again. Let's export the shape data, copy that to the clipboard, hop to After Effects, go to the mat layer, and on my hand roto here, I'll simply get rid of that, paste it, and that should be good. So let's go back to our bee swarm. And now we've got things kind of matted out a little bit. I can soften this a little bit, a couple different ways. I could go to the matte section and select Refine Matte. Go to Feather and feather out this hand shape a little bit. So that pretty much covers the form section of it. Now we could probably match the camera just a little bit better. The depth of field is off. And we can adjust the focus distance so that the bees seem a little bit more out of focus. I'm going to raise this focus distance up. These things will get a little bit blurrier and seem to fit into the shot a little bit better. So at the camera cut, which happens right here at the end of plate number 1, I'm simply going to select this camera, Shift Command D to split and duplicate that layer. And I'm going to disable this matte and manually put this back into place. And actually, to have this go a lot faster, I'm going to change a particle type to sphere. Get this exactly in position. The camera actually looks like it's rotated just a little bit. All right, so I have camera 1 and camera 2. Let's go back to form, set the particle back to sprite, and turn this alpha inverted matte back on. Now you can see why I used a pre-comp, because I can only use one track matte at a time, so I can have several mattes sort of nested inside here, and with the reference video, it just makes it, well, pretty easy to line up the mattes with the video. So let's put cut number 2 in here, set this to a guide layer, and let's go right here to this form matte. Let's select this one, duplicate that, or split it again, Shift Command D. And we might need to actually extend this. Really all we need is the top, and I can extend the bottoms of this out this way and that way. Truthfully, that is what I did in the original. It does not need to be aligned to the box at all, because there's always a bee that pops out of the side here or there, so you can kind of fake it. So cut to the second shot. We have our bee swarm happening with Trapcode form. But more importantly, we have a big swarm of bees that gets released from the box, and this is where we need to jump to Trapcode Particular. Okay, so let's set up the particle layer first. So let's make our particular bees. And so let's set up the particular layer. Again, I'm going to use FD toolbar. I've got particular in here. So let's create a comp size solid and apply Trapcode Particular. So I want these to emit in a specific direction. I want them to shoot upward and out of the box. So anytime I need to control a specific direction, like I want them to only go up, I think the best way to do that is to change the default emitter direction from uniform, which emits in all directions, to a directional emitter. By default, that shoots away from the camera, so I'm going to go to X rotation and turn that up 90 degrees, so it's actually shooting straight upward. I don't need that. Let's close that. Now, instead of emitting from a single point, we want to match it up with that box. So let me unsolo this and move it down and get it aligned with the box. So I'll have them start emitting right just inside the box. And now I'll go to the emitter type and change that from point, which we don't want. We want a larger area, box size area, so we can quite literally set that to box. So let's turn that out just a little bit, expand the emitter size X. Now there's all kinds of controls that we have here, and let's think about what we want these to do. So they're basically just kind of emitting straight up. We need them actually to move very fast, but not too fast, because we don't want them getting out of frame already. We also want some sort of frenetic nature to them. So we want a very sort of buzzing, swirling around. Now, we've got a couple options in here, and my first thought was to go for turbulence, to have them sort of moving around in a certain direction. But after I watched a lot of footage of bees, which YouTube has no shortage of, I saw that there was more of a kind of a back and forth motion rather than randomness. Instead of using turbulence, which uses a fractal field. I'm going to use spin, and spin basically makes the particle move along its path back and forth. So I'll set the spin amplitude. I'll turn that up. Spin amplitude is actually very easily seen if we go into the aux system, turn on emit continuously, and turn up the particles per second. There we go. Let's go back to physics, air, spin amplitude, and let's turn up the spin frequency. So now we're actually kind of seeing the paths of the bees, which I think this is starting to look fairly realistic. So rather than having that randomness, that turbulence, which I can show you, let's zero out the spin and go into turbulence and say have this affect the size. That's more of a noisy kind of path. And maybe that's realistic, I don't know, but it felt more realistic for me to use kind of a spin, mostly a spin. Add just a touch of randomness by going into turbulence field, just add just a little bit of it. There we go. All right, so let's turn that aux system off by going back down here and set aux system to emit off. So now they're quickly moving, having this sort of crazy bee kind of motion path. And now it's time to actually get the particle in place. What are we going to do for the particle? Well, hold on. Before we get too far, we have another thing to do here, which is the tempo device, which is triggered by this button right here. So he's got his thumb right on the trigger, and when the trigger gets pulled, which is right, actually let's solo the edit here so we're not trying to render any particles, right, boom, right there. Set a marker, shift 1, so we can easily jump to that point, and that's the big moment. Actually drop lab bees 2 plate in here so we have a nice version of it. Oops, and I got to scale it down. The original footage is 1080, so I just have to scale it down to my 720 count. So right there, we need to have these particles suddenly slow way, way, way down. So let's go to my particle section here under physics. What do I have soloed? There we go. And let's solo these. So they're moving, and right there they should basically freeze. So right here we have this physics time factor, and so it's kind of a global throttle for how time passes in Trapcode Particular. So a physics time factor of 1 means a 1-to-1 ratio of time in After Effects and time to your composition. We'll have a lower ratio, so we'll basically, a lower physics times factor will slow down the particle time. And that's what we want it to do. So I'm going to set a keyframe right there, and let's hit U to show that keyframe. I'm actually going to back that one up, and this is going to go way down. So let's set this to 0.01. That basically means it's going to go from a normal speed to a 1% speed. And how much we want that to ramp down is kind of up to us. Now it looks like we have a little bit of a caching issue. Let's go to emitter. Let's change my random seed. Occasionally After Effects caches in particles and then refuses to let them go, and you're seeing actually a couple things pop here. So there we go. That looks a lot better. So they go fast and then they suddenly slow down. Okay, now for the really interesting part. So we need these bees to go from really fast, with their wings flapping really crazy, to their wings going in very, very, very slow motion. Now, I'm going to pull up the original here, because this was actually a little bit tedious to set up. So let me pull up my original composition and drop this in here. So here's my bee swarm. This is the one you were watching me set up. I'm going to drop this composition in here, and let's open this up. So I have each of my bee loops in here, bee loop 1, 2, and 3. Each of these take 2 seconds and are treated as a 2-second loop, as a split particle type, just like we did before. I had 2 before, but now I have 3. There's one critical difference. If I open this one up, remember how I looped this 100 times over? In this composition, so we have not footage in here, but composition. So if I open one of these up, you'll notice that my B loop is repeated over and over, but I have my time stretch set to a very, very low value, right around 2%. It's set to right around 2% because 2% is basically speeding up the video quite a bit. So now the wings are flapping like crazy, more along the lines of what a bee would do. And actually, it's set to 2.1, not 2 on purpose, because that actually, just the speed that I had made this an easy 2-second loop when this was 2.1%. Yours might certainly differ, but mine just happened to be 2.1 to get an easy 2-second loop, and that made the math very easy here, where each of these is just 2 seconds long. So each of these is done the same way. So B loop 1, B loop 2, these are all stretched down to 2.1%. Their wings are flapping like crazy. But because I've used After Effects to do the time stretching here, After Effects still knows that those frames are squeezed in there. Even though we've set our composition to be 30 frames per second, there's a lot going on from one frame to the next in terms of frames that are there. And they're available to be sampled. That's the key. So let's go back to our bee swarm here. In fact, let me close out some of these extra compositions. Matte and this one. So we've got our 3x loop and our bee swarm. In fact, let's just turn that one off. Let's go to particular right here. Go to the particle type, set the particle type to a sprite, set the texture to time sample, split clip, stretch. So when I set this to stretch, it's going to take the time that it sees from the source particle and compress it into the time of the particle. If there's extra frames in there, which there are because we've sped it way up, we can enable subframe sampling to see those extra frames that otherwise are not visible during playback because they're moving too fast. But After Effects still knows that they're there. So let's set that layer to be the B loop. And let's turn up the size. So even though the bees are incredibly sped up, once we go down to this very low physics time factor, we can see that the wings are flapping quite slowly. And that is exactly it. So let me go back to our lab video right here and show you that this is exactly what we've got going on right here. So go into particular. You can see I've got my B loop 3x. I'm splitting the clip and stretching it inside the time span of each particle. And I've set this to 3 clips because that is the number of clips I have in my B loop. And I've enabled subframe sampling. And at that point where the button is pulled, my physics time factor goes from 1 and animates down to 0 right here. Also to have a couple keyframes in here to change the lighting just a little bit when it goes to this cut right here. And I also animate my particles per second. As the lid opens up, we have particles shooting out. And right about then, we don't need any more bees shooting out of the box. I'm assuming that they're pretty much all out. So we next cut to this other shot right here, which to quickly show you how that would be integrated. Essentially, I just use the After Effects camera tracker. Now, in this case, I've scaled my video to be a little bit smaller in my 720p comp, but my source footage is actually 1080. So I'm going to pre-compose this because otherwise the camera tracker will not work. So now it's pre-composed. The scale is 100%. I select track camera. It's going to go with the analysis. And to make a long story short, if I go back to my original here, we've got our tracked camera. And then just to position it exactly in place, you can just create a 3D null object. Parent the camera to that null and adjust the camera as you see fit to get it into place, either using Z or X or Y. And that's exactly what I did. I still have the same matte comp and the particular comp inside here. I've actually got some extra stuff that happens for the explosion, but like I mentioned, we're not going to talk about the explosion. But right here, we have a matte for the box. And essentially, this is just a box that is moving in 3D. I copied the camera from the tracked portion of my main comp and put it in here and just created a solid that matched up to where that box was. So as that box moves up, this can be used as a matte. And again, don't forget that we're simply using those background videos as reference. Also did a little bit of roto in here that you don't want to watch me do, like doing some roto for the thumb so that was something that could obscure the bees. Well, that was basically it. Now, this is the cool part when in the video where the bees actually hover in place, and then you can see that slow motion. So in the final render here, before it went through the film treatment, we have that before shot right here, and then it cuts and it has the camera pan. There's some depth of field to match, and a little bit of camera blur. So anyway, that is the bee swarm from Tempo. My name is Harry Frank. Thank you so much for watching.
Thanks, Harry. If you enjoyed this tutorial, check out Harry's site at graymachine.com, where you can find a whole bunch of awesome goodies, including free presets, tutorials, and a link to Harry's fantastic training DVDs, like Complete Training for Trapcode Particular or Trapcode Form Training. Also, don't forget to check out Harry's killer Red Giant Guru preset packs, looping backgrounds for Trapcode Suite, cinematic flares for No Light Factory, Video Rock for Particular, weddings for Trapcode Suite, and holidays for Particular. Because hey, it's always that most wonderful time of the year. And by the way, you can get all of those and much more as a part of the Red Giant Guru Suite. Don't forget, you can download a free trial version of the software that Harry used in this tutorial at redgiantsoftware.com, and you can get free presets for Red Giant plugins on redgiantpeople.com. And to keep up with the latest news about new products, tutorials, tips, and deals, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or on our blog. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for RedGiantTV.com. I'll see you next time.